You wake up every day wearing a mask so heavy it has begun to crush your spirit. You call it responsibility, you call it success, you call it who I am, but deep inside you feel it, a quiet suffocation, a life that looks complete on the outside, yet feels hollow within. You are trapped in a role, and that role is destroying you. From the moment you learn to speak, you learn to perform, be the good child, be the strong one, be the achiever, be the one who never fails, never titity. You stopped asking who am I and started asking what is expected of me. This is how the prison is built, not with bars but with habits, not with locks but with fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of starting over, fear of facing the silence that appears when the role is stripped away. So you stay busy, you stay productive, you stay praised, yet your body is tense, your mind is restless, your heart feels distant. The role demands constant energy but gives nothing back. It feeds on your time, your attention, your life force, until exhaustion feels normal and numbness feels safe. Understand this clearly. A role can be useful, but it is not who you are. When you confuse the mask for the face, you lose direction. When you live for approval, you abandon truth. And when you ignore the inner voice long enough, it begins to scream through anxiety, anger, and emptiness. You were not born to perform endlessly. You were born to live consciously, to step out of the role does not mean you become weak. It means you become honest. It means you choose awareness over autopilot. It means you finally stand still long enough to ask, does this life reflect my values or my fears? From the very beginning, you were taught how to fit, not how to feel, not how to understand yourself, but how to adjust. The environment rewarded obedience, not awareness. Approval became currency, and you learned quickly what earned it. When you smiled at the right moment, you were praised. When you stayed quiet, you were accepted. When you achieved, you were valued. Slowly, subtly, you began to associate love with performance. What started as adaptation became habit, and habit became identity. Over time, the role stopped being something you did and became something you believed you were. You no longer questioned it, because questioning felt dangerous. If you stepped outside the script, you risked rejection. If you paused, you risked falling behind. So you kept moving, kept producing, kept reinforcing the image others expected. The mind learned to scan constantly for external signals, adjusting behavior to match what would be rewarded. This is how self-betrayal becomes normalized. The problem is not that roles exist. Every society has them. The problem is unconscious attachment. When awareness is absent, the role takes control. You begin to measure your worth through comparison. You begin to silence inner resistance because it feels inconvenient. The body tightens, the breath shortens, but you ignore it because the role demands consistency. There is no room for uncertainty, no space for vulnerability, no permission to pause. Eventually, the inner conflict grows. The part of you that knows something is wrong does not disappear, it waits. It waits through long work days, forced conversations, and restless nights. It waits while you tell yourself this is just how life is. And when ignored long enough, it expresses itself through tension, irritability, fatigue, or a quiet sense of meaninglessness that follows you even in moments of success. The role thrives on distraction. As long as you are busy, you do not have to face the question of alignment. As long as you are praised, you do not have to confront the cost. But beneath the surface, energy is leaking. Decisions are being made from fear rather than clarity. Actions are driven by habit rather than intention. You may look functional, even successful, yet feel disconnected from your own experience. Awareness begins with noticing the gap between what you do and what you feel. Not judging it, not fixing it, just observing. Observing how often your choices are shaped by expectation. Observing how rarely you ask yourself what is true for you in this moment. This observation is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. It reveals how much of life is lived on autopilot, repeating patterns learned long ago. When you see this clearly, the role no longer feels solid. It begins to look like a structure held together by repetition. And repetition only survives when it is not questioned. The moment attention turns inward, the automatic loosens. Roles are not inherently harmful. They are frameworks that guide behavior, teach social navigation, and create a sense of identity. Yet the moment a role becomes rigid, it transforms from a tool into a cage. Each role carries expectations, both from others and from ourselves, and over time those expectations solidify into rules that govern every thought and action. The obedient child becomes the compliant employee, the agreeable friend, the partner who never confronts conflict. The strong one bears burdens silently, while the victim silently accrues resentment. Each role demands consistency. Consistency is rewarded socially, it makes you predictable, safe, and manageable. But the role has no interest in your growth, no interest in the messy, chaotic, transformative process of discovering who you truly are. Its priority is stability. Its priority is preservation, and preservation, when it overrides authenticity, suffocates life. The role suppresses your instincts. It teaches you to respond not to what is, but to what is expected. You learn to anticipate judgment, approval, or rejection, and then shape your behavior accordingly. Over time, this conditioning becomes so ingrained that the response is instantaneous, automatic. You don't even notice the moments when your own voice is silenced. The anger you should express is filtered into a polite nod. The passion you should follow is postponed in favor of practicality. Even your intuition, the subtle, quiet guide that whispers truth, is muffled because it often contradicts the script the role demands you follow. You become a living contradiction, a body moving through life in alignment with someone else's narrative, while your inner self screams for recognition. The role erodes connection with yourself and with others. When you act from a script rather than your own understanding, you lose depth in your relationships. Conversations become transactions, not exchanges. Decisions are made to maintain image rather than to reflect values. Friendships, partnerships, careers, they are navigated based on what is expected, not what is authentic. This creates a subtle but persistent sense of isolation, even in the presence of others. You may appear competent, kind, or strong, but internally you feel fragmented. You know there is a version of yourself that is undiscovered, unexpressed, and increasingly urgent. This gap between the internal self and the external role creates tension, stress, and a quiet despair that few understand because few are willing to confront the invisible walls they have built around themselves. The role also limits exploration and experimentation. Real growth requires trial and error, failure and recovery, vulnerability and boldness. The role, however, fears risk because risk threatens consistency. It teaches you to avoid situations that might reveal imperfections or challenge the narrative you have carefully constructed. This creates a subtle paralysis. You become cautious in thought, restrained in emotion, and predictable in action. Every choice is measured against the role's expectations rather than your own aspirations. Opportunity knocks, but you hesitate. Change is necessary, but you resist. Creativity, joy, and curiosity are sacrificed at the altar of safety and control. The role thrives on your unconsciousness. Its power comes from your unawareness. The moment you observe it, it begins to weaken. Awareness forces recognition that your behavior, reactions, and beliefs are often conditioned rather than chosen. Observation is the beginning of liberation because it allows you to separate yourself from the role, to see it as something external rather than inherent. Once you notice the scripts guiding your life, you gain the ability to challenge them, question them, and ultimately transcend them. Until that recognition occurs, the role will continue to dictate your behavior, subtly eroding vitality, spontaneity, and authenticity in ways so quiet you barely notice, but so pervasive that they touch every aspect of your life. Every role demands maintenance, and the labor of maintaining a role is far heavier than most people realize. It is not simply about showing up or performing a function. It is about constant vigilance over your thoughts, words, and even your emotions. Every reaction is filtered, every impulse measured against the invisible standard of what the role expects. The obedient one must constantly check for signs of disapproval. The strong one must suppress any crack in the armor. The ambitious one must avoid revealing doubt or hesitation. This mental and emotional monitoring becomes automatic over time, a second nature that masks the exhaustion it produces. You may not recognize it immediately, but your energy is drained by the sheer effort required to maintain the illusion of consistency. What others see as composure or reliability is more often than not a tightly controlled balancing act performed at great personal cost. Living under the weight of a role also produces a quiet, insidious tension. Your body registers it first. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, a restless mind. These are not random stressors, they are signals from your body alerting you that you are living out of alignment with your true self. The role thrives on control, and control requires suppression of natural impulses. You laugh when you should cry, you remain silent when you should speak, you endure discomfort when you should assert boundaries. Over time, this suppression accumulates, forming invisible chains that restrict the flow of your energy, creativity, and authentic expression. The role does not allow for spontaneity, because spontaneity could reveal inconsistencies, weaknesses, or contradictions that threaten the carefully maintained facade. Another consequence of maintaining a role is the erosion of genuine choice. Each decision is filtered through the lens of the role's expectations. What you want, what you desire, what you feel compelled to pursue, all are measured against the perceived needs of the persona you've constructed. You begin to confuse duty with destiny, conformity with loyalty, survival with authenticity. Opportunities are avoided, risks are postponed, and potential is stifled because the role demands predictability. The world may reward the role, but the self, the deeper, untrained self, is quietly sidelined. This creates a cycle in which life feels repetitive and constrained because you are responding to circumstances not from clarity or curiosity, but from the conditioned patterns dictated by the role. The role also feeds on fear, the fear of judgment, rejection, or loss. Fear reinforces the behaviors that preserve the role, which in turn strengthens the fear, creating a feedback loop. Every act of self-censorship, every withheld opinion, every compromise made to uphold an image validates the notion that deviation is dangerous. This keeps you locked in a loop of conditioned response, reacting from habit rather than intention. Even small deviations can feel terrifying because they require confronting the uncertainty of living authentically. You are constantly balancing the desire for freedom against the perceived security of conformity, and the longer the role dominates, the more exhausting that balancing act becomes. Awareness of this dynamic is the first step toward liberation, because once you see the logo, actual labor and cost of the role, you can no longer ignore its impact. When you recognize how much energy is consumed merely by maintaining appearances, the magnitude of the role's hold becomes undeniable. You begin to see the ways in which the role has dictated your interactions, limited your choices, and subtly eroded your vitality. This recognition is uncomfortable but necessary. It forces a confrontation with the truth that the role, though familiar and comforting, is not neutral. It is consuming the very essence of your life, and the act of maintaining it has been silently depleting your capacity to live fully. The moment you begin to observe the role that has been guiding your life, something subtle yet profound begins to shift. Awareness is the first fracture in the carefully constructed illusion that the role is who you are. When you start noticing the patterns, the automatic responses, the habitual compromises, you create a space between stimulus and reaction where choice becomes possible. In that space, you realize that your actions are not inevitable, they are conditioned. You see that the anger you suppress, the desire you hide, the fear you indulge, and the longing you ignore are all signals from your authentic self, not flaws or threats. Observation is the doorway to freedom, because without awareness, the role remains invisible, unquestioned, and absolute. Most people go through life never noticing the scripts they follow, reacting to disparity between what you have been presenting to the world and what you truly feel. The obedient one may discover a suppressed rebelliousness. The strong one may confront vulnerability. The caretaker may recognize unexpressed resentment. This awareness exposes the limitations of the role, and with exposure comes discomfort. You realize how much energy has been spent upholding a facade, how many moments of joy, curiosity, and spontaneity have been sacrificed in the name of consistency and safety. Observation also invites clarity. Once you see the role, you can map the ways in which it has dictated your decisions, shaped your relationships, and constrained your potential. You begin to notice the triggers that reinforce the role, certain people, environments, or beliefs that push you back into automatic behavior. Awareness allows you to respond consciously rather than react automatically, to choose alignment with your true self over adherence to an inherited script. It creates a sense of empowerment, because the illusion of inevitability, the belief that you must always act according to the role, is shattered. Suddenly, the boundaries of your life expand. You understand that you are not bound to the reactions, behaviors, or limitations that have defined you for years. Furthermore, observation cultivates resilience. As you watch the role without judgment, you practice sitting with discomfort, acknowledging fear, and tolerating uncertainty. The role resists these qualities because it thrives on predictability and control. By consciously observing it, you begin to weaken its grip. You experience the subtle liberation of realizing that your life is not dictated by external expectations, habitual patterns, or conditioned fears. Instead, you have the capacity to make conscious choices, to respond to life with intention rather than obligation, and to pursue authenticity despite risk. This growing self-awareness slowly erodes the unquestioned authority of the role. The more you observe, the more its influence diminishes. It no longer operates silently behind your decisions. Its demands, once automatic and invisible, now become objects of scrutiny. You begin to recognize the ways it has limited your freedom, dictated your behavior, and drained your energy. Observation does not immediately free you, but it initiates a process of awakening, one in which clarity and discernment replace unconscious repetition, and choice replaces automatic obedience. The role tells you that without it you will lose control, respect, or belonging, and this is perhaps its most insidious tactic. From the outside, the role often appears protective, almost nurturing. It promises safety, acceptance, and stability. But in reality, what it guarantees is dependence. The moment you question it, even subtly, the role triggers a deep visceral fear, the fear of being exposed, the fear of rejection, the fear of uncertainty. These fears are not abstract. They manifest physically in your body as tension, your mind as anxiety, and your behavior as hesitation. The obedient one fears disapproval. The high achiever fears inadequacy, the caretaker fears conflict, and the rebel fears isolation. Every role leverages fear to maintain compliance, convincing you that deviation is dangerous and that your survival, reputation, and connection to others depend on strict adherence. The more you obey, the more convincing the illusion becomes, until it feels less like a choice and more like a law of existence. What you are actually losing in this arrangement is not safety but authenticity. The role prioritizes conformity over truth, and in doing so, it extracts the life force from the individual. You lose the freedom to express your anger, your joy, your vulnerability. You lose the right to make mistakes, to experiment, to fail and recover in ways that are messy, human, and necessary for growth. The role convinces you that these sacrifices are necessary for stability. But stability without alignment is a hollow achievement. It becomes a cage disguised as protection. A set of rules masquerading as guidance, a routine that masquerades as mastery. You feel productive, responsible, and competent, yet underneath lies a quiet suffocation, a creeping sense that life is passing you by while you remain trapped in someone else's expectations. Responsibility is the true cost of stepping away from a role. It is heavier than obedience, not because it is more difficult, but because it is real. Responsibility demands that you face yourself unflinchingly, that you accept your flaws without justification and your power without apology. It requires that you acknowledge the consequences of your actions, both for yourself and for others, without hiding behind a predetermined persona. Whereas the role offers the illusion of control, true responsibility demands confrontation with uncertainty. It asks you to navigate relationships, work, and personal growth on the terrain of authenticity, where outcomes are not guaranteed and fear is not mitigated by routine. This weight is not a punishment, it is the raw material of strength. The stronger the resistance, the more the role clings, and the heavier the cost of awakening. Facing yourself also requires courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to act despite fear. To step out of a role is to court discomfort at every turn. You may disappoint others, you may risk social standing, job security, or approval. You may confront criticism, doubt, or misunderstanding. And yet this confrontation is the very process by which you reclaim power. The role thrives on avoidance, convincing you that security lies in repetition, predictability, and suppression. True empowerment, however, is forged in the friction between fear and action, between the weight of responsibility and the courage to honor your authentic self. Once you accept that the fear imposed by the role is an illusion, you begin to see that the loss it threatens is largely imaginary. You realize that control, respect, and belonging, real respect, real connection, real influence, come not from conformity but from alignment. When you act from authenticity, when you accept the responsibility of being fully yourself, the world responds differently. The role is stripped of its power because it relies entirely on your unconscious adherence. Recognition of this dynamic is transformative because it
reframes fear, not as a limit but as a signal. The presence of the role, the point where conformity and illusion intersect, and the threshold you must cross to reclaim your life. The moment you stop defending the role is the moment your real strength begins to return, though it is rarely immediate or comfortable. For years, your energy has been siphoned away, funneled into maintaining appearances, suppressing desires, and negotiating fears that are largely manufactured by the very role you
inhabit. That energy once trapped is like a reservoir behind a dam, restrained, stagnant, and often unrecognized. When you begin to release the role, that reservoir starts to flow again, bringing vitality, creativity, and clarity that have been dormant beneath the weight of expectation. But this flow is not effortless. It requires confrontation with discomfort, confrontation with uncertainty, and confrontation with parts of yourself that have long been neglected or denied. the stronger the fit has been, the more shocking and disorienting the awakening can feel, because for the first time in a long while, you are no longer protected by predictability. Strength emerges not from resistance alone, but from authenticity. Every action, decision, and expression that is aligned with your true self reinforces your power because it is rooted in reality rather than performance. The obedient one who finally speaks a hard truth, the caretaker who stops overextending to meet external expectations. And habit. Once you stop feeding it, it begins to crumble, leaving you in direct contact with your own capacity. Reclaiming strength also involves reclaiming freedom. When you no longer defend a role, you no longer need to spend mental and emotional resources on the performance it demands. The moments once consumed by calculation and self-monitoring are liberated, opening space for spontaneous thought, bold action, and genuine expression. You begin to notice desires and ambitions that have been buried under the weight of conformity, and with recognition comes possibility. You start making choices not from obligation, fear, or expectation, but from curiosity, purpose, and alignment. Each choice that honors your authentic self reinforces your confidence and resilience, because it proves to you moment by moment that you are capable of navigating life without the crutches of the role. The process also strengthens your capacity for discomfort. The role exists to shield you from risk, uncertainty, and social friction. By stepping away from it, you expose yourself to all of these realities, and in doing so, you train resilience. Each encounter with discomfort is a rehearsal for courage. Each moment of vulnerability is a rehearsal for honesty. Each decision made in alignment with your truth is a rehearsal for power. Real strength is forged in this crucible, not in the comfort of obedience or the illusion of safety. Moreover, ceasing to defend the role restores clarity. Without the distortions imposed by pretense and expectation, you begin to see your circumstances, relationships, and personal priorities with unprecedented accuracy. You recognize where energy has been wasted, where attention has been misdirected, and where compromise has been unnecessary. That clarity is empowering because it allows you to act strategically, decisively, and intentionally, rather than reacting passively to the world around you. Each decision made from this place of clarity reinforces your autonomy, and with autonomy comes an ever-strengthening sense of self, a sense that was always present but buried under layers of performance and habit.